Welcome to the Haunted Hangover podcast. I'm Louie, and I'm joined by my boy, Grimey.
We up in this bitch.
We are up in this bitch. And I want to use a line you used in the last episode we did in the Universal Monsters journey. Grimey, are you ready to unwrap the mummy?
Ooh, I see what you did there. Yeah, I'm
Yes.
ready, man. This was a fun watch. I can't wait to get into it.
You I don't know if you remembered, but you ended the show saying that. You corrected me and you added that in. So I said, you know what? I gotta throw it back to the last episode and kind of hit you with that.
Did I say that? I don't remember saying that. So
I know we both between both of our shows, we record way too much. We don't remember what we said in the previous recording. So that's usually
oh man, the months just fly by.
Yeah, dude. I'm sure we've all been quite redundant on each other's shows. On my show for sure, I've been redundant. I tend to repeat myself quite a lot. And I'm sure with Leftover Pizza, you guys have said things on repeat several times. So it happens. When you've recorded a lot of episodes, it just goes with the territory.
At this point, I'm not even sure if anyone's listening.
they gave up halfway through.
They're just skipping through.
Yes, get out of here with that. I don't care about your nostalgia and Halloween shit. Get out of here. But yes, The Mummy 1932 is what we're going to be talking about today in this Universal Monsters journey. But yeah. I do want to highlight something here because we're doing something a little different with this film. It's kind of very loosely a two-parter. So I wanted to kind of shill a little bit here at the top of the show because for the normal listeners on the normal podcast feed and on the YouTube channel, you're going to be able to listen and watch this episode of Grimey and I go in depth, dive deep into 1932's The Mummy. But if you're a Haunted Hangover hooligan over on Patreon, paid subscriber, paid member, I don't even think it's a subscriber, it's member, right, Grimey? Is what they use, the lingo?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. Grimey and I are going to have another bonus show exclusive for the Patreon members where we talk about some of our favorite mummies in the world of nostalgia, pop culture, horror, all that good stuff. And I will say, some choice picks. So,
oh, yeah.
If you're not a member,
we had to dig deep for the mummies this time around. There's not too many mummies out there, so I think the list that we've got going is pretty nice though. So check it out.
We've got one or two deep cuts, some very popular ones as well in there, and that's something you and I are gonna do. I think next time we hit a Frankenstein movie, we'll do some of our favorite Frankensteins in nostalgia and pop culture and horror. Next time we do another Dracula film in this journey, we'll pick some of our favorite vampires and Draculas, Invisible Men, Gilman, whoever,
Eric?
whatever. Eric, we're gonna do a whole gorilla
We're gonna look
episode.
at some pretty cool apes.
I feel like a gorilla will show up eventually once again, and they'll just give us a reason to record another episode special for Patreon to just talk about our favorite gorillas in pop culture. So
they're all going to be Harambe and Eric.
That's it. You also mentioned Harambe. You ended the last episode with a Harambe. Yes, with a Harambe shout out.
Oh man.
So, yeah, man, pour one out for Harambe. People forget about Harambe. I feel like he's been lost in the vortex of social media and viral shit.
I think you're right.
But yes, that's enough rambling there from me. Let's dive into The Mummy from 1932.
The Mummy. Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman? You'll know. You'll see. You'll feel the awful, creeping, crawling terror that stands your hair on end and brings a scream to your lips. There's nothing on earth like The Mummy.
Now, this was a first-time watch for you, right, Grimey?
It sure was. Yeah, a very fun first-time watch. And I understand that this was not your first time?
It was not. I feel like this is similar to Dracula and Frankenstein. This is one of the quintessential Universal monster movies. So I think this might have been one of the earliest ones I actually sat and watched. I might have seen this before Dracula, like in my history of watching these movies. So I'm pretty sure.
Kidding.
Yeah, I think early on, many moons ago, when I think I rented this, I'm pretty sure it was like Frankenstein, The Mummy, then probably The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I didn't watch them in order, like the way we're covering them in date order.
Right.
So I think The Mummy was one of the earliest ones. But I will say it's probably one of the ones I revisit the least. So,
yeah, I feel like that's pretty common. You know, I feel like The Mummy just kind of gets lost behind Dracula, Frankenstein, and even the Gill Man. Like he's the one that people don't care about as much, even though he is one of like the big seven, I guess, maybe 6, 7, whatever, however many big ones there are.
He kind of gets not as bad as Eric the gorilla, like in the last episode, who gets the shaft. But whenever you look at the logo, and even me looking at it right now, he's always off to the corner, never front and center. The Mummy. He's always off. He's always off on the side.
Shit, you're right.
Yeah, he's always way so I'm looking at my Universal Studios Fright Night poster, which if you're watching this, you can't see. It's off screen on my wall. And he's all the ways to the right of the poster. All the way. Even the Gill Man is next to Dracula. So Mummy gets kind of he gets the shaft, like you said. Him and the Creature from the Black Lagoon kind of get the shaft, and I think that's just because he's a mummy, and you know, everyone knows mummies. They're of historical significance, like especially with Egyptian, you know, history and lore and all that stuff, which I will not claim to be an expert on. So that's where that will end completely. But I've always liked the Mummy, and I will say this. When we get to the sequels, the Mummy character shifts drastically from where he goes in this movie. Like what the character in this movie does compared to, and even the way he looks compared to some of the other Mummy sequels, very different. The way he's depicted, his end goal, just kind of like the cheesiness of the films. When you think of a mummy, you think of the bandaged up monster, and in this film he's really not that version for long. It's very short. You know,
that actually threw me off a lot, because every depiction I see of the Mummy, and like, well, you know, you got the Universal Universal Studios Pepsi marketing, and the Doritos marketing, and pretty much every image you see of the Mummy, he has the wraps, and I mean, there's figures of him. Every one of them is a wrapped up figure. I don't think there's one that's kind of a clean version. He's literally like that for maybe 5 minutes, if that. And
if that, yeah.
You don't see him you don't even see like all of him really in a couple of spots. You just see like some draped cloth rolling across the ground, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think that's why, and it's funny that you watching this for the first time were taken back by that, because I can tell you right now, when we get into some of the sequels, you will be pleasantly surprised to see that version you know and love of the Mummy all wrapped up permanently. It's a fixture of the rest of the franchise.
Oh, that's perfect. That was that was one disappointment for me.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think when people watch this movie, that's probably one of the things they're like, oh man, he's not the toilet paper mummy that I think of when I think of these films. So it is what it, even I think the first time I saw it, and I think I was in high school when I rented this, back to that Frankenstein mummy story I told a couple minutes ago, I was also like, wow, he just looks dried up. Like he's a man that needs lotion the rest of the film. You know, he's not.
Totally.
Totally. He needs some
Lubriderm or something.
Lubriderm, yes. He's just a dried up dude, not the wrapped up, gauzed up guy that I expected that I see in toys and cartoons and in pop culture. So I can see that being a disappointment, but the film overall, when you do sit and watch it, is lovely. And
oh yeah, it's way better than I expected it to be honest.
Yeah, and it plays into like that mummy, while not prominent, that version does make an appearance, and it does kind of play into the rest of the film. There's a lot of sarcophagus, and we're gonna get into it. There's a lot of sarcophaguses and Egyptian artifacts and things like that. So it's not missing any of those aspects that you would recognize in a mummy movie. And you know, it's funny, we're talking about the wrapped up toilet paper mummy. Even when you watch And, you know, I think when most people think of The Mummy, this is what they think of in 2024. But the Brendan Fraser film from the late 90s, he's kind of barely that version as well in that movie, which I, funny enough, recently watched because I hadn't seen it in years. It was on like Peacock streaming. I threw it on because I knew we were going to cover this movie. He's really only the decomposing, wrapped up mummy for maybe the first 3 or 4 appearances. And then he starts to look human for the rest of the film. So I love how even in that version, they kind of kept in line with that version of the mummy that becomes human slowly. With this one that we're talking about being more dried up.
That's funny that you mentioned that you watched the Brendan Fraser Mummy after you watched this, because that's exactly what I did. It was like the moment that movie was over, I went right to this Mummy. I was like, I know that a lot of this stuff kind of carries over. And that's saying a lot, because this movie was like the first of all the like mummy movies ever, and it kind of set this tone for every mummy movie that would come later on. Like, and it's very apparent. Like, you see all of the little things that carried over in, even like you said, the Brendan Fraser mummy movies. It's pretty similar, a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, you would think like, oh, it's a loose remake, but there's plot points that are lifted from this, like the basic plot of the film is lifted from this movie, minus Brendan Fraser being being like that character doesn't exist in this film. Right. But you could say maybe one of the characters in this movie was the inspiration for Brendan Fraser's character in the 90s Mummy remake that features Imhotep and reincarnation and Egypt and all that stuff. And I will say, listen, not to hang on this too much on the late 90s Mummy movie, but that's a fun film. I enjoy it. So
I love like the first one, first two. They're both pretty good.
Yeah, man. Who doesn't like a really shitty Dwayne The Rock Johnson as a scorpion at the very end of that movie? Oh, man. Terrible CGI.
Absolutely the worst. Yeah.
But I still love it. So bad it's good. But let's dive into The Mummy, 1932. So, was released. This is an interesting date. December 22nd, 1932. 'Tis the season. Quite festive.
You're going to wrap your presents? Figure you might as well wrap a dead man.
Exactly. I was like, wow, they dropped this right before right before Christmas, which is interesting because when you look up this movie, it didn't do it was a commercial success, but didn't do as well as Frankenstein or Dracula. So maybe it being released around Christmas or so close to Christmas, you know, maybe people weren't flocking to the cinemas to go see a horror film with, you know, a guy trying to bring his dead girlfriend to life. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, you're probably right. I don't know.
You know?
That makes me love it just that much more. And yes. Now I'm going to include it on my Christmas rotation. So thanks for that. Had no idea.
It's officially a Christmas film. The Mummy Christmas movie. You know?
You heard it here first. Yep.
That's it. It was directed by... And I'll be honest, another warning. I always warn everyone. Redundant, I know, but I'm going to butcher half of these names. Forgive me, guys that are listening. Forgive me, listeners, because
I feel that in my soul.
Yes, I'm going to butcher probably half of these names. But the director of the film is Karl, I believe it's pronounced Fround, which I think is a German last name. It sounds German. Interesting note about this dude. This was his first American, directorial debut in America, but he was the cinematographer on Dracula. So there's a fun fact. Also, cinematographer on Metropolis. You know, the science fiction silent film.
Oh, yeah.
So he worked on both of those movies and directed his first feature with The Mummy. This was his first big kind of directing gig. So I was like, oh, nice. Interesting. And he's going to be popping up again in another fun production note I have jotted down here in my notes. And when we get to her in a second, talk about her a bit. It stars our boy, Boris Karloff as Imhotep. Probably, I have a question for you, Grimey. At this point, 5 films in, are you as of right now, more of a Boris Karloff guy or a Bela Lugosi guy? Keep in mind, we've watched two films apiece from
Right.
each of these gentlemen. And listen, they're both iconic. They're both great. So you're not knocking the other one. But as of right now, after watching The Mummy, we last covered Murders in the Rue Morgue and watching The Mummy, that starred Bela Lugosi. This starred Boris Karloff. We saw them play their iconic characters, Dracula, Frankenstein. Who are you going with as the one you prefer as of right now? It might change. So
It's really tough, honestly, because they both play like both roles that they've played excellent, and they're so different from the other one in ways. Like, I would have to give it to. Oh man, I'll say Bela. I'll say Lugosi.
wow, really?
I really like Lugosi. Yeah, I think that. I thought about going Karloff, but in a lot of ways, I feel like he's still kind of playing that Frankenstein character in this movie, just like somewhat. Like he's very, I don't know how to say, kind of just his posture's very tight. He's not very loose or anything, and he's just stuck straight up in the air like that, and it's a very similar vibe to Frankenstein as far as his character's look goes when he becomes the Imhotep. Or I can't remember what his actual name is in the movie.
Oh, the fake name he puts up. It's Ardath Bey is the fake
That's
name.
The name.
Ardath Bey is the
you
name.
can
he
never.
gives them.
I can't be expected to remember that one at all. It's such a weird name. But I feel like the vibe is very similar. So he's kind of playing the same mannerisms, I guess, in this movie, whereas Lugosi, he is playing two very different characters. And so just based off of those 4 movies, I'm going to give it to Lugosi. But, I mean, like you said, it could change later.
We're going to break even here. I'm going to go with Karloff. And the reason why, here's my reason why. Up until this point, and they're both going to pop back up several times as we continue. That's why I said up until this point, because it can change as we continue. 5 more movies from now, we might feel differently. And I believe they do make other appearances. They're going to make several appearances as we continue. But the reason why I'm going with Karloff right now is because the Frankenstein monster and Imhotep, we had a character that was all physical. And I agree, he's stiff in both performances. But he didn't speak at all in Frankenstein. Whereas here, he spoke. He's a little more lumbering, and he's kind of doing the same shtick. He's supposed to be stiff and dry, like we joked.
Right.
So I do like that. And there's something, and they both have iconic voices that have been parodied. There's something about Karloff's voice that reminds me of horror, Halloween. He just has, like, you think of the Monster Mash because that's the voice that he's like parodying in that song.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, that is the voice. And I just think Karloff, they both have this presence that's demanding on screen, but Karloff is more intimidating, I feel. And you see it in this movie. Like,
he's very intimidating.
There's one scene where he flat out is like, "Don't touch me." Like, and the guy doesn't touch him.
I prefer not to be touched.
Yeah, and there's a scene later on where we get into our likes that I really love that involves him. And it's like, he's a bad motherfucker in this movie. Not to say that Bela Lugosi is Dracula and, in Murders of the Rue Morgue, those characters aren't like tough dudes. But I feel like in this film, he is like, he'll kill you. Like, there's no joking.
Oh, yeah. He's cold.
He's cold, yeah. So I do like even a tough character who doesn't take any shit was even like pressed by him. Like, all right, man, I'm not gonna mess with you. So that's why I'm leaning more towards Karloff. And I also think at this point, up until this point, the 2 characters Bella played, one of them is iconic. The other one, not so much.
The other one's not so much. Yeah, you're right about that, man. Absolutely.
Whereas the Frankenstein monster, even though we kind of joked that the mummy gets the shit end of the stick, but Imhotep is the quintessential mummy. Like, he is the mummy.
Oh, yeah.
So both those characters and just the images of the Frankenstein monster, the mummy, Imhotep, we think of Boris Karloff's face. So
truly.
And you know what? We each picked one of them. So
yeah. They both got love. You know?
They're both winners here up until five films deep. They're both winners here.
Yeah.
Even though
this could have went either way.
Yeah. Even though one of the films, neither one of them was in, because it's technically just a Spanish remake of what Bela Lugosi did. But nonetheless, still 5 films in, and we saw 2 films from each of them. So we're like, you know what? Which one did you prefer?
You have studied our ancient arts, and you know that you cannot harm me. You also know that you must return that scroll to me or die.
Next in the cast, we've got Zita Johann as Helen, the love interest damsel in distress, which we joked about the last episode, that all these films kind of have the same plot. But I will say the character of Helen does have a moment or two here where she's a tough girl. She's not like, she doesn't need the men, and is more, I guess, more important in defeating the monster at the end than in some of the previous films we've watched. The previous 3, technically, if you don't count the Spanish Dracula, where they're kind of the monster just, kidnapped. Don't get me wrong, she gets kidnapped in this as well, but she's more important to defeating the monster at the end than the men, kind of having to confront it.
Yeah.
Would you agree that Helen's a tougher character in this movie? Like, she's got more of a backbone in this film?
Oh, yeah, totally agree. There's a lot of different parts in the movie. One, and I don't want to get into it too much, but what the hell is his name again?
Which one? Who?
The mummy's fake name.
Ardath Bey.
I never.
Listen.
Ardath Bey. God damn it.
Ardath
it's horrible.
Bey.
She's having a conversation with this man, and she's kind of like stuck in her tracks, and they're trying to get her to go home or whatever, and she's just kind of like, no, we're not doing that. I'm going to stay right here where I'm at. But there's certain instances like that in this movie, and yeah, I totally have to agree that she's a lot more independent than a lot of the other women we've seen previously.
Compared to like even the last film where like the lead, I forgot her name, the lead female in that, who she was good, but she was just there to be carried around and thrown around and kidnapped. Where in this case, there is kidnapping, there is mind control, but Helen handles her own in scenes against Imhotep. Like, she doesn't take any shit. And I think that has to do more with the plot. And when we get into the plot, that, I guess, is what drives the character to be a stronger figure in the overall kind of story they're trying to tell. I do have one thing that I thought was really interesting about the kind of the behind the scenes production on this movie involving Zita Johann and the director Karl Freund. So I have I watched it as part of the box set. This has like 6 of the films on it. The Mummy,
nice.
The Mummy, one of the many discs on the big box that I have. This is how I've been watching all the films. I think I mentioned it in an earlier episode of our Universal Monster movies coverage. There's a documentary on there. It's about 30 minutes, and Zita Johann and the director Karl Freund did not get along. He tortured this woman. It almost reminded me of the relationship Stanley Kubrick and Shelley Duvall had on The Shining. When they were making The Shining, like when they were making that movie, if you know the history of that film, they did not get along. He kind of tortured her throughout that entire production. And in this movie, he did not get along with her. He complained to the producers that she was like stuck up and hard to work with. One really interesting tidbit. So, when you're working on a film set, they give everyone a chair. Everyone gets a chair to sit on. He didn't give her one. Like, she purposely, he left her out. Yeah, left her out and did not get her a chair with her name on it. He made her stand an entire shoot and used her wardrobe, preventing it from creasing, the reason why she had to stand up the entire time. And
that's horrible.
It's horrible. He treated her like, again, we joked around, but like women were not treated well in the 30s.
No, not at all.
They were looked down upon. It was horrible. And yeah, he had her stand up an entire shoot because she couldn't crease her. He was being vindictive, obviously.
Yeah.
It's
like, your application says you can stand for 18 hours.
Yeah, and this was a pre-code film, so there were no film laws. So they would just, basically torture some of these actors with some of the stuff they had them doing, long hours, wardrobe, makeup,
Brutal.
and we're gonna get into the makeup in a minute here. But yeah, she did not have a good time making this film because of Karl Freund. One more thing, and this scene's deleted in the movie. There was apparently this whole sequence where we see the character that she's the ancestor of throughout different times, living and dying. There was a scene where she was surrounded by lions, actual living, not fake lions, real lions. She was so exhausted and tired of the abuse she was taking from the director that she didn't even give a shit. She just walked into the lion's den, was around them, didn't care, was just like, I'm over this. If they eat me, it is what it is. So Zita Johann did not have a good time making this movie.
Oh my God.
So it just goes to show you that if an actor in 2024 went through that, they would have quit this shit a long time ago. They would have not dealt with any of that. Like the mistreatment, she was just being mistreated by this guy. But she toughed it out and made the movie. So, and she is really good in this. Like,
I really enjoyed her character a lot.
She's really good. Kind of going back to what we said before about it being a strong woman finally in one of these films. You know, don't get me wrong, there's some tropey shit with her too.
There is, yeah.
She is more independent, like you said, and she does have more scenes by herself that don't have the men kind of throwing her around and stuff. It's funny. Right now, Pluto TV has a Universal Monsters channel, and I sometimes put it on in the background, like when I'm cleaning, my apartment or editing and stuff. And my wife was watching it, and she's like, wow, they really treated women like shit. She noticed it. They're like, a woman? Huh. Like they scoffed at the idea of a woman knowing anything. And I was like, that was back in the day. Like that's how they treated women in movies. That was the narrative back then, that women weren't smart and not tough and not independent. So it's just funny, we've said that the last few episodes, but it's just funny to see it like kind of dying down a bit in the Mummy. At least it dies down a bit, that kind of the way women were looked at in film, even though she was treated like shit behind the scenes. So in real life, she was not, she was treated like a slave basically. So not fun. Moving on with the cast quickly here. Our boy is back, Edward Von Sloan, who I've grown to really like him in these movies, man.
Oh, hell yeah. He's a staple in these movies now, man.
He's playing Dr. I believe it's Mueller or Muller is pronounced. Yeah, Mueller. Third time we've seen him in a Universal Monsters movie. We've got David Manners as Frank. And then we've got Arthur Byron as Frank's father, who I believe his name is Joseph. Sir Joseph is what they call him in the movie. So, because they come into play, they're kind of the principal. Those are mostly the principal characters in the film. Again, these two characters are kind of tropey. Frank and Joseph, very tropey father and son duo. And even Dr. Mullen, who I really like, Edward Von Sloan, he's kind of the Van Helsing in The Mummy. He's kind of playing the same character
pretty much
in this. More heroic, tough too, a tough SOB. And on the topic of Dracula, and we said this in our chat, we were texting each other back and forth. This is Boris Karloff's Dracula film, right?
It really is. Yeah, it's like the same exact formula, and we'll get to more of that very soon. But like, that's the whole time I was watching this, I was like, all right, yep, there's that, and there's that. There's very little differences, but it's still a really great movie. I still stand by that.
I'm guessing, like, when it came to Boris Karloff wanting to portray a character with dialogue and exposition and monologues and things like that, after Frankenstein, this was a good way of him showing off his talent in a way. We were joking about, who's better so far, but in reality, this was the movie where he was able to showcase that, where he actually, we loved him in Frankenstein. We both agreed he was great in that. But here, he actually was able to like say shit and have lines where he didn't have any of that in Frankenstein. One more thing here, and we'll dive into the synopsis, that I thought was really interesting about the production of this film was it was originally written. So the producers at Universal, when they were trying to make another film, they always look for ideas, and they have people that are writers. They came up with the idea for this film. They had a treatment for this film called, it's called Cagliostro, I believe is how you pronounce it, Cagliostro.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the treatment of the film. And the plot for that concept and that idea, you had an old magician who was immortal because he was injecting himself with nitrates. And they had someone rewrite that script. And the person who rewrote it was involved in archaeology and Egyptian, I guess, history at the time, something along those lines. And they're the one responsible for injecting the mummy aspect, changing the name, the title of the film, the Egyptian kind of backdrop, the love story, focusing on that love story aspect instead of revenge, because the original magician plot was more on him wanting to kill people and get revenge. Whereas now the mummy focuses more on this guy wanting to bring back the love of his life, bring back his girlfriend from the dead, and reincarnate her to, right? That's the word? Reincarnate her.
That's it.
Yeah, reincarnate her to
That's
bring her
wild,
back.
though, man.
Yeah. So
this could have been a completely different film.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that that's kind of what the original, plot was. So very different how they went from that to an Egyptian mummy movie. So I thought that was a cool little production note and just the behind the scenes story of creating this film. One more thing I want to mention. One more thing here. And I know we're rambling, but one more thing before we get into the plot. Dude, the makeup, and I learned this in the documentary, watching the documentary. It took 8 hours to put to put Boris Karloff in the wrapping.
Oh my God.
And get all that makeup done by Jack Pierce, who we mentioned in Frankenstein. He's infamous for all these monsters, creating most of these monsters, the makeup design and stuff, back in the 30s, where he was using these really outdated techniques, at least outdated now, to create these monsters. And it took 8 hours to get him in that. And it was torturous. And they had I thought it was interesting. They had a fun little story which can tell you how torturous this was. They forgot to put a zipper on the bandage suit.
Oh my God.
So my man couldn't even pee. He had to
sucks.
Yes, that sucks. I was like,
I'm curious how long he was in there like that.
Well, that's what they said. They were like, they did all this work, full body outfit, and we're going to get into it, but full body outfit, makeup. They put clay in his hair to slick it back to make him look like a mummy. And it's only on screen for 3 minutes, and you don't even see him. You only see him from like the chest up. You don't even see everything. So it's like the guy didn't even have to wear pants technically. And you could have just had him be able to use the bathroom whenever he had to go. So very sad to hear that Boris Karloff had to go through that. He said it was they were saying how he said it was one of the most uncomfortable, I guess, costumes and characters he ever had to portray. More so than even the Frankenstein monster, because at least with that, it was just his hands and his face and his head, not his whole body. So for such a minuscule scene, this dude was a trooper to just kind of make it look authentic. So crazy. I just wanted to sprinkle some love on Boris Karloff here and just his portrayal of the mummy in that 2-second scene.
The only other thing I got before that is I don't even know if this is true. I'm pretty sure it is, but don't 100% quote me on this. I already mentioned that this is kind of the pioneering mummy film. It's the first of its kind. From what I read, what I understand is that this wasn't based on any literary work before this, like Dracula and Frankenstein was. Mm-hmm. I just thought that was really awesome. So it's like such a very original concept, and stuff that we have today, almost nothing's like completely original. And just hearing that something like this, and it spurred off all these other movies later, that kind of blew my mind. So cool.
Yeah, you're right, because everything up until this point was based on a novel or short story or something like that. So That is cool. I didn't write that in my notes, so that is a good little tidbit of information. Just,
Man.
original content, even in 1932. Good stuff.
Have we not met before, Miss Grosvenor?
No, I don't think so. I don't think one would forget meeting you out of the...
Then I am mistaken.
So the first thing I wanna mention here, this is the third movie where the opening credits use the song Black Swan. Dracula used it, and Murders in the Rue Morgue used it. Very popular jam back in 1931 and 32, I guess.
It comes on and they start dabbing. They're like, yeah.
Yes, they used it again in The Mummy, which I'll be honest, that song is not very Egyptian, so I don't really know why that was a thing, that they had to continue using it. I tried to Google why they used it, and I really couldn't find anything, unless it was in the public domain and it was free to use. That's the only thing I could think of why they kept using it. But
I would assume that as well.
Considering it's 1932, the world was a very different place, so I don't even know, what people's mindset, what it was like with music back in the day. So maybe Black Swan was like Taylor Swift back in 1932. Who knows? And speaking of music,
must have been.
This is the first one, at least in the films we've covered so far, the first Universal monster film to have a score. So
yeah, that caught me by surprise. It's like, oh, this is it. This is the one.
Yeah, so music was a big aspect of this movie that none of the previous films we've covered so far even had. It was a lot of quiet. Where in this case, they actually had someone come in, or even if they took it from other stuff, they actually used music to kind of help tell the story and give scenes a certain atmosphere and a certain vibe, which I appreciated. And it definitely helped this movie, especially in some of the montages and stuff like that. So the film opens. We meet Joseph Wemple, an archaeologist, along with his friend, Dr. Muller, digging up the mummified body of an Egyptian priest by the name of Imhotep. Dr. Muller has a bad feeling about said mummy and insists that Joseph put the mummy back in its resting place and that this mummy was buried alive and probably not a good man. That's my Cliff Notes version of the conversation those two gentlemen have. He's not a good person, was buried alive because he did something that was not good. So while Dr. Muller and Joseph have this conversation, Joseph's assistant, who I did not write down his name, my apologies, he's not that important to the story anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Not really, no.
But his assistant begins to read from like this ancient scroll called the Scroll of, I believe it's pronounced Scroll of Thoth? Thoth? Am I right, Grimey?
Yeah, I think so.
And this scroll was buried with Imhotep. While he's reading this springs and brings back Imhotep. He comes back to life and walks off as the assistant screams manically. He goes nuts because he's watching a dead man come back to life.
Yeah, he's like screaming and laughing and just hysterically laughing, and like it makes you feel pretty uncomfortable. I kind of love it.
This whole opening sequence is fantastic. Just the way they shoot it, showing Dr. Muller and Joseph outside, having a conversation about the mummy and how he's warning Joseph, don't, put the mummy back. Don't fuck with him. Don't, you shouldn't be doing this right now. I have a bad feeling about it. Then cutting back to the assistant reading from the scroll, reading the ancient language and dialect, whatever. And then the mummy, you see Imhotep slowly, his eyes open, his arms move. And then that one last shot, I love it, of the bandages across the sand on the floor.
Across the floor.
And
yeah,
then him
oh my God.
just screaming. Classic.
Yeah, it's a very very eerie, very creepy sequence. I really, really enjoyed that whole entire scene. It's like, this is, and it's the first scene that you're hit with, really. I mean, it's not a slow burner, really, right at the beginning there. It's just kind of like all hits you at one time. But that's all you see him in as a mummy.
Like I said, you never even see his legs. They couldn't put this guy in like
No, not
shorts or
really.
something. Like he didn't have to wear that whole outfit. But yeah, that one shot, man, gold, so good. Just
It's good.
it is like you said, eerie. It's creepy looking. Like I wish we would have seen him limping, like that classic mummy limp, but we don't ever get
Yeah,
to see
me
it,
too.
unfortunately. So this is where things get a little weird in the narrative. So several years passed by. I had to look this up because I missed it, but apparently a decade. 10
Yeah,
years.
yeah, 10 years.
Which these characters didn't really age much. These already
No,
kind of
not
middle-aged men didn't really age much in 10 years. So I was like, okay, I almost missed it. And I watched this twice within like a 3-day span. And I knew some time had passed, but I didn't realize it was a decade. So I thought that was interesting. So a decade.
Yeah,
had
I
come
remember
and
it being
gone.
a decade. I don't remember where they said it at. I know they were talking about the man that passed away, and I think they say something about it being 10 years ago to this very day or something. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but yeah, a whole decade passes.
So at this point, with all this time passing, Imhotep has taken on the identity of Ardath Bey, your favorite name, Grimey.
I just forgot it already. Completely forgot the name again. It's just such a weird name. Like,
I'm guessing it's Egyptian. That's kind of probably.
maybe.
I'm assuming that's kind of why he went with that name, because he is Egyptian. Boris Karloff, the most European or German-looking Egyptian I've ever seen. I don't believe Boris Karloff is actually Egyptian, but he's portraying one in this movie. So whatever. Ardath Bey is kind of the persona he's put on. So he's also, the backstory of this character he's created is that he's like this Egyptian collector, historian that's involved with this museum. He either lives at the museum, owns the museum, he's always at this museum. So I didn't quite understand that. I think that's what it is. He approaches Joseph, and this is where we meet Frank, his young, handsome son, Frank, to assist him in digging up the body of an ancient princess named, here we go, Anek Es Aman. I think it's Anek Es Un Aman is the name of
Ankh and Amen?
There you go. You did better than I did.
Ankh and Amen?
Ankh and Amen, this ancient princess. They would dig up her sarcophagus. Do me that solid. And the two of the men are like, all right, cool. We'll get the slaves to dig her up. No problem. And that's what they do. So they excavate this mummy princess, and they take her to this museum. They put her on display with all these other artifacts. The body exists. The sarcophagus exists. It's there for everyone to see. We also meet Helen, a beautiful half Egyptian woman who this is also another weird subplot. So Dr. Mueller is taking care of her. He's her caregiver. You would think she's like 15, but she looks like a grown woman, so she's obviously an adult. I think. Yeah. She's not supposed to be a teenager.
There's a lot of gray area there. I wasn't sure what was going on either. I was like, but yeah, whatever. So she's got like a sugar daddy, I guess.
Yeah. Is she supposed to be young? Is that what it is? Is she 17 and he's her adopted father? Is it her older lover? Like you said, sugar daddy?
Yeah.
It's never quite
I'm not sure what
explained.
was happening.
It's an odd way to introduce Helen, because there's like this whole scene between Joseph and Dr. Mullen where he's like, "Oh, I'm taking care of Helen now, and she's my girl." Whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, she also has a striking resemblance to Princess
Ankh and Amen.
Amen, whatever.
Yeah.
So
Imhotep believes that she's the reincarnated self of Ankh and Amen. So he's kind of trying to get closer to her to bring the mummy version of her back to life. Gets lost. It's very confusing.
Yeah, and then she's also cursed. So Imhotep puts a curse on her after learning of her existence, and basically he's smitten for this girl because she looks like his dead princess. And we're going to get into the backstory in a second, which is told in monologue. But yeah, he's smitten by her when he meets her, and she looks familiar, and he's kind of becomes infatuated, much like Dracula did, much like the Frankenstein monster did with the kind of male protagonist's love interest, because this curse kind of backfires on Imhotep. The curse he puts on Helen backfires because Frank, Joseph's son, starts to fall in love with Helen very quickly. But that's part of the like, that's like a side effect of the curse Imhotep puts on Helen. Which I'm like, Imhotep, that's a terrible. Why would you curse her? Like, why curse her if this handsome guy can fall in love with her and become infatuated her?
It's
very
like making
strange.
someone horny and throwing them off to like a random stranger. Like, here you go.
But it's like, here's a really handsome or good-looking person that's around her age and not all dried and shriveled up like you. And he's going to fall in love with her. And Helen kind of likes him too. Like, they're making out. They're like, touching each other's shoulders because that's what you did in 1932.
He's ready to take care of her.
Yeah, he's ready to handle business. In several scenes, I'm like, wow, this guy is ready to go. It didn't bother me that much. Fine, whatever. You got to give, the antagonist, there needs to be a hero to kind of help defeat him and be involved. And there's always got to be a love interest in these movies. So I get why Frank was involved. So you mentioned Imhotep's backstory. So here's what it is. And this is all told through a great, fantastic kind of flashback that he shows Helen in his giant sacred pool that he uses to also, he murders people and stuff with it. So he's got this pool that he has in this sanctuary that he lives in at the museum. So his plan is to kill Helen, mummify her, then use his priest magical powers, his Egyptian priest powers, to resurrect her and make her his eternal bride forever. That's basically a gist of Imhotep's plan and what he wants to do. And that entire kind of scene, I love that flashback. We see Imhotep get, we see him trying to bring his original princess back from the dead because she died for some reason. And his father sees him, and his father punishes him by burying him alive. We see him get the bandages placed around him, and we see them put the scroll in the sarcophagus. It's a great scene. There's even some gore where we see like the slaves get speared and the spears kind of go through them. Really cool effect.
Yeah, that kind of blew my mind because like the only thing that really had real gore in it so far that we've seen was the murders in the Rue Morgue. Like we saw a couple of little scenes there, here and there, where there was like a stabbing or whatever, and it still wasn't very graphic. But this shows a spear through a guy's fucking stomach, like all the way through, and he like falls and is just like stuck up by the point. It is pretty graphic, like by I would assume 1932 standards. It's just fucking crazy. I was kind of blown away by that.
Yeah, and there's even like a little blood coming out. We do see blood, and so it's not like it's like a dry. It's not like the spear goes through the dude. At all. There's actually some color there. There you go, a wrestling term. A little color, some blood, a little color coming out of them. So I thought that was cool. Like you said, kind of the first gore effect in a Universal monster movie. But that whole sequence is really cool. Him kind of. It's very James Bond villain-esque, like laying out, and he even does it later on in the end, lays out the whole plan, tells Helen his whole spiel, why he's doing it, all exposition, what his end goal is, and like, I'm sorry, girl, you gotta die, become a mummy, and then I'm gonna resurrect you so that you can be my bride forever. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I dug that scene.
The pool's a very strange device too. Yeah. Like I thought that was kind of an interesting way to, because then, like you said, he does kill people through it using like mind control and stuff. You see him like clenching his fist a few times and people just die. And this whole time he could have just been splashing that water in his face and moisturizing it a little bit.
Yeah, come on, Imhotep, man. What's going on there? A little. What's the other? You said Lubriderm, and what's the other one?
Lubriderm.
Lubriderm is another popular lotion that's really. Put a little cocoa butter on there, man. Come on, what's going on? A little cocoa butter. But yeah, so you mentioned deaths by the hands of Imhotep using his magical pool. One of them, unfortunately, being Joseph, Frank's father. He is killed by heart attack by Imhotep. Imhotep forces a heart attack on him through the magic pool. Dr. Mueller, and Frank realize that they have to get their hands on the scroll of Thoth and destroy it in order to kill Imhotep and save Helen. So Dr. Mueller tells Joseph several times, and Joseph is just like, whatever, kind of blows him off. They're like, once you destroy the scroll, once you destroy, that's a mouthful. Once you destroy the scroll of Thoth, this will defeat Imhotep. And it's a very sacred item to the mummy in order to defeat him. So their plan, Frank and Dr. Muller's plan, very similar to Dracula, like we said, is to follow Helen, very reminiscent of them following Renfield in the original Dracula, so they can find Imhotep and then burn the scroll and defeat him and kill him. So
I didn't even pick up on that. That's a good point there. Yeah. I missed that by a mile.
It gets a little convoluted, hence why even me explaining it here is kind of like all over the place. Because even in the movie, it's all dialogue and it bounces around a lot with these different things that are vital. So you've got Helen, you've got the guys who the men don't really play much. Like Frank and Dr. Mullen exist, but they don't really play much into defeating Imhotep at the end. It's that kind of just like, we have to go and get Helen and protect her. And they don't amount to shit, basically. They're not even the reason why the scroll itself is burned. So Helen ends up in the palace. Imhotep almost kills Frank by using the magical pool and also giving him a heart attack because he takes off this medallion, this necklace that Dr. Mullen gives him. And he takes it off because, we need to use this to protect Helen. And it backfires. And Imhotep's like, I'm going to kill you. Blah, 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 and he uses his magical pool to kill him. Again, all over the place.
It really is.
After Imhotep explains his entire plan to Helen, she starts to freak out, and she's dressed up in her like Egyptian garb at this point. And she's realizing, because there's kind of like a dual situation here going on where she's Helen and she's also the princess, the mummy princess, that I'm not even going to try to repeat the name here again. I'll let you do that, Grimey.
Anka Sanaman.
Thank you.
Yeah, she's both of them at the same time, and it's like, well, which one is she now? That gets kind of confusing too.
Yeah, because it goes from, it's like her being hypnotized by Imhotep and agreeing to what he wants, and then her realizing that she's two different people and she can't go through with this because she doesn't want to die, which I don't blame her. Who wants to be killed and turned into a mummy? There is a great visual where he lights up the original princess's body up in flames, like her mummified body just lights it up. Great visual, looks excellent. And there's really no difference between the two. She just kind of talks the same way. It's great. Like, she's great in the scene, but it's like her having memories of this princess, but then also Helen. So like, there's no different in accent, or doesn't really change. She's the same.
Yeah, not much.
Yeah.
There's at some points it gets a little bit monotone, but other than that, it's pretty much the same character.
So Imhotep controls her. Frank and Dr. Mullen, they head to the museum. They want to confront Imhotep, but they're late. Like, they show up like mid, like, again, completely pointless. And there, Helen, as the princess, I think, prays or does some sorcery to the statue of Isis, which burns the scroll. And this is what defeats Imhotep, turning him into a pile of bones. And that is the end of the movie. That was very abruptly, like most of these films, that was The Mummy, 1932.
I could get my hands on you, I'd break your dried flesh to pieces.
Now, Grimey, that ending, you know, we usually we start with some more things we like, but since we ended there with the ending, I will admit, as much as I love this movie, even just me reading back what happens at the ending there, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. It's all over the place. And it feels that way when you're watching it. That all happens in like 10 minutes. All of that.
Yeah. It's quick.
It's not even like the last... and the movie's only an hour and 14 minutes. It's short, so I get it. And all these Universal Monster movies end abruptly. But usually they're a little simple. Like Dracula, they follow Renfield. They come across Dracula's coffin, stake him. He's dead. Everyone's happy. Frankenstein... Dr. Frankenstein confronts him. You know, the windmill.
Yeah, they're usually
you know, the windmill
pretty
gets
like
burned
cut
up.
and dry.
Yeah, exactly. This, you know, the Isis statue, Helen being two people, the men being worthless, Imhotep explaining his whole like spiel, his whole scheme and what he wants to do. It is hilarious how much they cram into 10 minutes. And it's probably
it's very suspenseful.
Yeah. It's the one thing about the movie that I wouldn't even call it a dislike, because I do really enjoy this film. It is great. It is well made. But it's just like, okay.
Yep.
All right. Let's roll with it. That's basically, because even like Helen, I get it. She's the princess now at this point. Being able to control that statue, which I think it was Isis, because I remember her saying that in the movie, and using that to burn, which I like that it was Helen that defeated Imhotep, not the men. Yeah. I like that. That was cool. Going back to what we said earlier about the women being more important to the plot. Especially
girl
Helen.
power.
Girl power, 100%. So I do like that, but it's just like they cram so much. They should have just had it. Like they didn't need to explain all of that. We could have understood most of this without all that exposition. I guess would kind of make it better. But what did you think of the ending?
Pretty much the same as you.
Okay.
I do feel like it was just jumbled so much into one little time span, and I can appreciate it in one hand, and at the other side, I'm just kind of like, was it necessary to have all of this all at one time? What could they have done to shorten this and still kind of get the same result? But that's what we got, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't hinder the movie.
It makes for an interesting story.
Yeah, like it didn't affect my enjoyment of the film, but even watching it, and when I watched it the second time, I told myself the same thing. I was like, wow. There's like a lot of moving part. Like they had to they didn't need to shoehorn the guys into that ending. In reality, they didn't. I get why they did. It was 1932 and men needed to exist, but they could have just had Helen defeat. And I get like they walk into the scene and she defeats Imhotep and the movie's over. But they didn't really need them to even take part. They could have killed Frank off, in all honesty, and the movie would have still ended the same way. So that's kind of my only nitpick with the film. But overall, dude, excellent movie. Like, what did you think of the overall film? The overall film, just as a whole, not having seen this.
Overall, I thought it was really, really a great watch. Like I said before, it surprised me. I did not expect it to be as entertaining as it was. But it kind of blew my mind, honestly. And it was really, like we also said before, it's nice seeing Boris Karloff in a speaking role finally. I know that he has speaking roles like later, but this is the first time that we came upon a speaking role in this series here. So that was appreciative. It was different, man. I love a lot of the scenes where you see a lot of the Egyptian set pieces and stuff like that. Like they're just very elaborate set pieces. Even in the beginning, right before you actually see the first scene, there's this really, really nice, like mini, you could tell it's kind of like a mini pyramid that they kind of shoot in stop motion or whatever kind of thing they do there. But it's just pretty beautiful pieces that they use for the set work.
Yeah, it's the production design, and that kind of goes with the territory with all these films. I think all the movies we've covered so far, The design, the set design, production design is spot on. It's fantastic. Just kind of, this is very Egyptian. This has a lot of Egyptian flair, sarcophagus and pyramids, and there's even a cat which goes hand in hand. You know, we didn't mention the cat, but Imhotep's like lair, he's got a little white cat, which is really cute, just sitting there in a lot of the shots. And cats kind of, you know, when you look into Egyptian and mummy lore and all that, cats are very important. You know, I think in some stuff, cats they're scared of cats, and in some stuff they look at cats as gods. So I like that little attention to detail with the little white cat. I agree though. Just overall, when you think of a Universal monster movie and just kind of the dark nature of Frankenstein and the gothic style of Dracula, this is a little different, you know, and it's still, I guess, can go, you know, head to head with those movies, because this isn't a dark film. Like, we covered even Murders in the Rue Morgue, relatively dark film, very, you know, it takes place in France, and it was dark, and obviously everyone knows Dracula's very gothic, Frankenstein very much science fiction. You know, what we think of a 1930s science fiction film, it's Frankenstein, for God's sakes. This is just, everything is bright and dry.
It is.
And I love that, dude. Like, I love how none of these movies look alike. Like, they didn't recycle sets, you know?
Yeah, you're right, though. This definitely, it can hold a candle to Frankenstein and Dracula. I mean, the creep factor's there, the atmosphere's there. It's very similar, but like it doesn't have that same, you know, very overshadowed tone, I guess. Like, it doesn't have a whole lot of shadow work. No. It's not dark at all. Like, it's very right in the middle of the day kind of stuff, and they managed to pull that off. It's an excellent film.
Yeah, which fits the aesthetic of Egypt and mummies.
You
think of like gold and bright suns, and
sand
and all that. So they were able to heat. You were able to they were able to capture that, and even the look of the mummy, Boris Karloff as Imhotep, outside of his initial mummy wrapping look, he even looks. You know, I joked around about Boris Karloff, the Egyptian. I don't think he's Egyptian. His background, as far as I know, maybe he is. Maybe someone can correct me, but. Him with his hat and his like dress, I guess, that he's wearing, his Egyptian garb, and
he's got like a robe kind of thing.
Yeah, it looks. He has sandals on. Later on, he's wearing he has this tied up belt and almost like Aladdin style, I guess.
I was gonna say, it looks like he came right out of a live action Aladdin film. Yeah, it's pretty good. Like, it looks pretty accurate to what the time should have been.
It's spot on, and it's funny how that's not the iconic look of the Mummy. Everyone looks at the version we talked about earlier, and in reality, for I'd say 60 minutes, an hour of this film, he is that version of the Mummy. And it's just great, dude. Like, he's great, man. He's really good. Another character, and I have this written down in my notes that I just love. I thought, and I said it earlier, Dr. Mullen, Edward Von Sloan. This is, to me, so far, I thought he was underutilized in Frankenstein. You know, the monster kills him in that. He doesn't really do much. He's great in Dracula. I think of the three, this is my favorite role. I think Dr. Mullen, he's just a tough son of a bitch in this movie. There's that one scene where he confronts Imhotep, and I wrote down the line here. He goes, "If I could get my hands on you, I'd break your dried flesh to pieces." Yeah. Yo, I was so good. This dude wants to fuck up Imhotep, but he knows he can't because the guy is like a sorcerer and has powers. Yeah. It's very Van Helsing. It reminds me of that scene in Dracula where, and I said it in our Dracula episode, where he confronts Dracula. When Van Helsing confronts Dracula, I think in this scene, that delivery, that's a tough motherfucker. He's like, yo, dude, he's like not even a foot away from Imhotep, and he tells him if he could get his hands on him, I'd break your dried flesh to pieces. Like, He takes no shit. Like you in the movie, Dr. Mullen, you could tell he does not like Imhotep. I don't know why. He's just a bad mummy and does not like him, and he wants to defeat him. He never gets a chance, but just the role is it's so far my favorite like role of Edward Von Sloan. I've grown to really like him in these last 3 movies. Like just his characters, his presence on film, on the screen. I just like him. Like by the end of this, I think I'm gonna become a big Edward Von Sloan fan. I'm gonna have to watch other
man, you're gonna
stuff
have
he's done.
Edward Von Sloan posters all over your room.
He's great, dude. I think,
Hell yeah.
like I said, I think this was my favorite character so far in these films. So I just thought he was really good. Is there anything else you want to kind of shine some light on that you really liked about this movie?
I did like that there was some music involved this time to like kind of help carry the film. It did help in some spots, but other than that, I think we pretty much just about covered it all.
Yeah, the one thing that I want to mention here, last thing, and then we'll close out the show here, but we mentioned the Dracula comparison. And there's even shots in this, which I do like, of Imhotep. It almost looks like a still shot, and his eyes are glowing. And it reminds me of the shots of Bela Lugosi with his eyes where they do that atmospheric lighting where his eyes are only lit up and everything else is in shadow. And I love that. I forgot that was the thing until watching it for the show. I was like, oh shit, they kind of do a Dracula gimmick here where he's, kind of hypnotizing. Mostly does it to Helen.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. And it's very reminiscent. And if you had to go, to wrap it up here, which film did you like more? Since this is, and I know this is comparing, again, this is us comparing Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff. If you had to pick a film, Dracula with Bela Lugosi's performance as the main character, the titular character in that, or Boris Karloff, the Mummy, who he's Imhotep, he's the main character of this film. Similar performances, similar situations, similar plots. Which one did you prefer? I know, again, and they're both great, and I know it's tough, but which one are you going with?
Again, I think I'm going to have to go with Bela, man. Wow. I really enjoyed Dracula. That my first watch through. That was just... It was life-changing, to say the least. but I don't know. Like I said before, this could just go either way. They're both so good, and they're very similar. I think why I picked Dracula over this is because it came first.
Yeah.
And this borrowed a lot of that stuff. I could have easily just said The Mummy, but I feel like just because the sheer fact that they did borrow it all from that kind of, it feels like it was borrowed. I don't know if they meant to do that or what. But
I'm sure it was influenced.
It feels, yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, I feel like they did it tastefully enough. It wasn't like, I don't know, I guess a direct copy from it, but
I'm right there with you. Dracula, to me, I think Dracula, when you think of Universal monster movies, kind of going back to what we said in the beginning of the show, how the mummy gets left in the dust. Ha ha. That's a funny little pun right there. But I think listen, he's dry. I think when you think of Universal monsters and just that franchise, you think of the aesthetic of Dracula more. But I will say that The Mummy has a lot to offer. It has all the characteristics of a good Universal monster movie, as well as kind of not being pretentious, but I think the plot is a little more intricate in what it's trying to say and what it's trying to kind of show off. And the aspects of the female lead I really like, which is quite different from Dracula, where she just kind of was just there to kind of, get saved in the end. And I like that. I just think, I think if you're going to watch, and they're all different, they're all completely different types of films, but I think if you're going to watch The Mummy, a Mummy film, or watch a Universal film, don't skip this one. I think you should watch it. I think it doesn't get enough love Similar to Murders in the Rue Morgue, we both really like that movie, and no one talks about obviously the Mummy's more popular, but no one really talks about the Mummy. Everyone gushes about Frankenstein and the Wolfman, which we haven't even gotten to him. He's far away, the Wolfman. We still got several movies till we get to him. But give it a watch, give it a chance. It's like most of these films, it's slow. But when it picks up, and it leaves you intrigued enough to see where it's going to go. And I just think it needs more love. Much like Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mummy needs more love. Imhotep needs more love. Not just Brendan Fraser. There's more to The Mummy than that film. Like, I feel more people like around our age know that movie and don't know this Mummy from 1932. So,
immediately. Yeah,
I'll close it out just by saying, give The Mummy 1932 a watch. It needs more love. More eyes need to be put on it. Maybe it's just like horror fans I see don't talk about it enough, but I just think it's a great movie. Overall, as convoluted as it gets at the end, still a very well-made Universal monster movie.
I want to live, even in this strange new world.
For thy sake I was buried alive. I ask of thee only a moment of agony. Only so can we be united.
So that was The Mummy, 1932. Next up, Grimey, we've got another big one. Another guy who uses bandages. Funny eth, we've got The Invisible Man. So
John Cena.
Yes, can't see me. Grimey,
I'm very excited to get into it.
Grimey, where can people find you and Leftover Pizza?
Oh, you can find us over at leftoverpizzaclub.com if you're interested in reading some stuff, or you can check us out on Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever the cool kids are calling it these days, Facebook. Just type in Leftover Pizza Podcast. Something's bound to show up. And if you feel like listening to us, we're on pretty much all major platforms. Just type in, again, Leftover Pizza Podcast, and you'll probably find us.
And be sure to subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok at Haunted Hangover. Head over to hauntedhangover.com for links to our Patreon page where Grimey and I have a part 2 to this episode, a bonus episode talking more mummies. So head over there, check that out. You also get early access to episodes and other spooky bonus content. Rate and review us. That'd be greatly appreciated. And as always, remember, the best cure for a hangover is
more booze.
Catch you guys later.